Good afternoon, and welcome to Making Change Happen in Nonprofit Organizations. We're happy to welcome over 500 registrants today as we begin this complimentary webinar offered by Columbia Business School Executive Education. My name is Jason Belland, and I'll be your host for today's online event. Before we begin, I just want to call your attention to the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You can use this box to ask questions of the faculty during the presentation. And once we get to the Q&A section, I will relay those questions and engage in a discussion with our faculty presenters. And now I'd like to introduce one of those faculty members that are with us today, Professor Ray Horton. Professor Horton joined Columbia Business School in 1970. He founded the Social Enterprise Program here at the school, and now he's the Faculty Director of Programs and Social Enterprise at Executive Education. Welcome, Professor Horton.
Thank you very much, Jason. It's nice to be here. And it's nice to have a chance to say a few words about the Developing Leaders Program, and even more importantly, to have a chance to turn the floor over to my colleague, Joel Brockner, who's going to talk about one of the major themes that's presented in the one-week program. I'll just say a word or two about the development of this program. When I became Faculty Director of Programs and Social Enterprise 3 years ago, the one-week course that was offered was titled the Middle Management Program, and we were never completely satisfied with either the title or the purpose of the program. So in the past 2 or 3 years, we've made substantial changes in the program, and they've worked to very good effect. If I could summarize those changes very briefly, it would be that we're spending more time on what I would call the sort of leadership development component of the course, and a little less time on the sort of basic management training. And we did that because we were really sensitive to the fact that a lot of nonprofit organizations, not only in New York City, but around the country, had leadership development issues that were very substantial. So we now put a lot of emphasis on curricular materials, training materials, the 360 survey, all of which are designed to help people develop their leadership talents and skills. So the program is going to be running in February of 2002. The deadline for applications is still 2 weeks away, December 31st. 2012, excuse me. And the deadline, as I say, is December 31st, 2 weeks away. So if any of you are interested, we hope you, pop up with some questions now. So I'm not going to say anything else. I'm going to turn the floor over to my colleague, Joel Brockner.
Great. Thanks, Ray, and thanks, Jason. It's great to join the group here. I'm happy to provide just kind of a little snippet of what the program is about. As Ray pointed out, and kind of befitting the changes he alluded to, it was the title's now it's no longer the Middle Management Program, but the Developing Leaders Program. And one of the things that leaders need to make happen, as most of you know, is to make change happen. It's oftentimes said that what leaders do is they're able to move some people from point A to point B, in other words, bring about some type of significant change. So I'm going to give just a brief overview, talk for maybe about 15 minutes or so about, and in a sense this is kind of a microcosm of some of the things that we'll be talking about throughout the week-long program that Ray alluded to. Making change happen, and I think it's safe to say that many of us are dealing with organizational change of different sorts. And change can take a number of different forms, as indicated on the slide in front of you. Sometimes we downsize, sometimes we grow through merger or acquisition, or we might grow organically. Sometimes the change takes the form of relocation or restructuring or the introduction of new technology or outsourcing. And indeed, as I go through this list, I'm hopeful that you're thinking about some of the changes that are taking place in your organizations. And the reason why we have to deal with change is fairly straightforward. Even though dealing with change itself is not straightforward, the reason why we have to is because our external environments are constantly in a state of flux. So either in response to or in anticipation of where the environment is going, either in terms of constraints and demands and threats or new opportunities that were never there before, We introduce strategic changes, cultural changes, the kinds of changes that are listed in the slide, in front of you. It kind of it gives support to the age-old expression that the only constancy is changed. It might surprise you to learn who said that first and when it was said. So a couple of hints. It was not Jack Welch when he took over GE 30 years ago. You have to go back further in time. It wasn't the French philosophers from the 17th and 18th century. You need to go back to ancient Greek times. Heraclitus, an early instructor of Aristotle, Socrates, said 2,500 years ago that the only constancy is change, which I think is a great commentary on the expression itself, the fact that it was first uttered 2,500 years ago. If anything, the nature of change has changed in the sense of it becoming more pervasive, more intense. There's more at stake in terms of organizations managing change well. And as a result, we thought that in the program we couldn't do enough to try to hone people's change agent skills, again, as part of the toolkit of being a great leader. So one of the things that we've tried to understand, given change, is what are the factors that influence how employees react to the change? Think of two extremes. On the one hand, excuse me, on the one hand, you sometimes find employees saying, this is great, glad we finally got around to doing this, we wish we did this a long time ago. In other words, they're motivated, they're enthusiastic, they're excited about the change, on the one hand. On the other hand, what we sometimes see is people having the exact opposite type of response. They feel questioning, they're uncertain, they're scared, they're demoralized, in other words, resistant to the change. And the question that we've tried to understand in our research, some of which we share in the program, is what are the factors that influence employees' reactions to organizational change, and in particular factors that managers, change agents can actually do something about. So it's not a grand theoretical exercise, but rather what are the factors that make a difference, and in particular factors that people like yourselves who are trying to make change happen can actually control. And what we find is that there's two broad categories of factors. One is what employees would call or experience as the outcomes of the change. And I think at the end of the day, people ask themselves the question, as a result of this change, am I going to be better off or worse off? Broadly defined. So it could be better off in terms of career prospects, or it could be better off or worse off in terms of the nature of the work that they're doing. Did it get more interesting or less interesting? It could be better off or worse off. Let's say it was a relocation. One thing people ask themselves is, well, is my commute to work a shorter commute or a longer commute? So lots of things go into outcomes. And what we find, and will probably come as no surprise, is that people are more willing to embrace rather than resist a change if they think the outcomes are going to make them better off rather than worse off. Now, that probably will not come as a surprise to many of you. You didn't have to go to Columbia Business School to learn that principle, but it does have some important implications for people who are agents of change, and that is part of their job is to convince as many people as possible in the organization how they're going to be better off, or at the very least not worse off as a result of the change. So outcomes matter. The other factor that seems to make a difference is not so much the outcome, but the process. People are very sensitive to, their reactions very much depend upon how well they feel the process was handled. So over and above whether they think they're going to be better off or worse off, do they feel it was done well? And I'll spend the rest of today talking about what do we mean by a well-handled process. But it includes things like were people given a good explanation of why the change was necessary and how it would enable the organization to move forward? Was the process accompanied by a vision of the future state? Was there when possible, were people allowed to participate in decisions that were going to affect them? Were they given a reasonable amount of advance notice about when the changes were going to occur, and so forth. So outcomes make a difference, and process makes a difference. Again, people react better if they think they're going to be better off rather than worse off. They react better if they think the process was handled well rather than poorly. And those are two factors that managers or change agents can control, or at least they can control people's perceptions of these two factors. We've actually done some research which shows how employees react to organizational change, and the numbers that I'm showing you basically illustrate the points that I've raised already. So the higher the score, the more favorably employees are reacting to the change in terms of productivity, morale, commitment, and the like. So we look at how people respond as a function of the outcome of the change and the quality of the process. There are some interesting nuances in these numbers that I don't have time to go into today, but they are, again, a nice summary of the results of many studies showing that people react better when outcome favorability is high rather than low, and they react better when the quality of the process is high, rather than low. I'll skip through that slide. So what does it mean when we say that a change process was handled well? What does it mean? Well, it's really a whole bunch of things, and it ultimately can be organized by the following formula or equation or conceptual model that I've organized on this slide. So change happens when the people who are responsible for planning and implementing the change do the following things. First, they have to surface dissatisfaction with the current state, with the status quo. It's the old saw, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? So if people are not convinced that the system is broken, they're not going to be very motivated to fix it. So you first have to point out a gap or a discrepancy between where we are as an organization and where we need to go. And unless that gap is clear and compelling, then there's not going to be much impetus or motivation to change. However, if you only surface dissatisfaction with the current state, you will not be seen as much of an inspirational leader, right? You'll be seen rather as a wet blanket, as somebody who's too negative, who's only talking about what we're not doing. So it's not enough to surface dissatisfaction with the current state or the status quo. You need to show people a better alternative. And that better alternative is oftentimes captured by the V word, vision. So you need to convince people that where we're at is not acceptable. Moreover, there's a better place for us to be, and that better place is, again, embodied by the vision. Even that's not enough. We need to have a process in place that will move the people in the organization and the people in it from the dissatisfying status quo to the better future state, so P for process. And furthermore, the fourth element of a successful change management, change implementation process is for change agents to reduce the costs of change. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes employees will experience change as costly. In other words, they're going to be resistant to the change for a variety of reasons. So what great change agents do is they understand the resistance. They understand the costs of change. Again, costs as defined by the people who are having to go through the process. And they find ways to reduce those costs, or that's another way of saying they find ways to lower people's resistance to change. So the formula that I put at the bottom is really more of a conceptual model, not a mathematical formula. It's a way of thinking about all the things that need to happen in order for change to be successfully implemented, or said differently, for employees to embrace rather than resist the change. When the driving forces towards change, dissatisfaction, vision, process, outweigh the costs of change, change will happen. Okay? It sounds a little overwhelming in the sense that I am saying that lots of things have to happen for change to be successfully implemented. I am saying that. What hopefully is a tad less overwhelming is the fact that I'm not saying that you as an individual manager have to be great at all of these aspects of change implementation. I'm simply saying that you need to be able to supply something towards that equation. So if, for example, you're very good at the big picture, you're very good at surfacing dissatisfaction with the current state, and you're very good at talking about the vision of the future state, but you're not as good at the implementation details, which is more in the domain of the process of how we move from point A to point B, more in the domain of how do we reduce people's resistance to change. I'm not saying you all of a sudden have to become great at everything, but what I am suggesting is that if you're great at the big picture stuff, you might want to partner with other people, other agents of change, who are very good at the implementation details. Because if you work well together, if you supply the big picture framing of the change, and your colleagues can supply the implementation details, then we have all the ingredients that are necessary for change to be successfully implemented. It might be instructive if I give at least one example within each of those categories. So it's one thing to provide a conceptual model, D and V and P and C. Sounds kind of theoretical and academic. We don't mean for it to be that way at all. So let me make it downright concrete and specific. One example of surfacing dissatisfaction with the status quo is being strong in the ability to analyze the need for change, which I've defined as you see on the screen. You identify strengths and weaknesses. You figure out what are the causes of the weaknesses as they might reside either internal or external, to the organization. So one of the things that we'll do in the program, by the way, is we'll ask people to assess themselves as agents of change. So Ray mentioned that there's a heavy focus on leadership development, and there's a good deal of self-assessment as well as 360 feedback, getting feedback from other people along various behaviors pertinent to leadership and management. So in the survey, one of the questions that we ask people to assess themselves on when it comes to planning and implementing change is item number 1, as you can see. I clearly describe to people why the situation as it exists prior to the change is not acceptable. It's often said that if you're not going to be a participatory manager, if you don't have time for that, then at the very least be an explanatory manager. Somehow people are much more likely to get on board if they feel like they were given a reasonable, adequate explanation of why we need to change, and moreover, it has to be communicated in a respectful way. So giving good explanations and communicating them sincerely is much more likely, you'll find that people are much more likely to get on board. An example of a vision aspect of change implementation, and you can see I'm defining vision, mental image of the desired future state of the organization, which provides a reason for undertaking the goal. One of the things that people need to do as agents of change is item number 6 from the survey. I remind people of our common vision, throughout the change effort. And the important word there is remind. You can't just at the beginning of some change effort say what the grand vision of the future state is. You need to constantly remind people of what we're trying to move towards and why. You have to perhaps communicate it in different ways. It might even be, from the change agent's perspective, almost a little bit boring to be giving the same message, because you know that you've already told them this, and why do I need to tell them this again? But no matter, they need to hear it again. They need the constant reminders of what the common vision is, throughout the change effort. An example of process, and process is multifaceted. I just have time to talk about one of the subfacets of a well-handled change process. Helping people to separate from the past, which means engaging in change practices which enable people to leave behind the old ways of doing things that might have been successful in the previous day, but they no longer work in the current day. So an example of that, from the survey, item number 10, when telling people about the need to change our current practices, I show respect towards those practices that have served us well in the past. Sometimes when change is introduced, the people in the organization experience it as a sign of disrespect. They take it as a message of, well, you mean what we were doing up till now was wrong, incorrect, improper? And people don't like to feel disrespected. Now, they could feel disrespected by the change, but they don't have to feel disrespected. It really depends upon how it's handled. So, for example, if you were to say, look, we needed to change, and here's why, let's recognize that the way in which we used to do things made a lot of sense, so let's honor it, let's respect it, but also recognize that we need to move forward and do things in a different way if we want to continue to be successful. And it's a funny thing that if you sometimes acknowledge transition, or if you respect the old ways of doing business, then people feel much more free to leave them behind, to separate and move forward and do the new kinds of behaviors that the change requires. And one final one is, again, dealing with the C element, or in other words, reducing the costs of change, lowering people's resistance to change. As indicated, people will often experience change as costly and therefore resist it. So reducing the cost of change requires addressing the bases of their resistance. At the end of the day, people will be resistant, I think, for two reasons. One, because they don't think they can do the new behaviors, right? They might want to do the new behaviors, but they don't think they can. if that's the basis of their resistance, then maybe what the change agent needs to do, and again, from the survey that we'll give out in the program, item number 32, is to make opportunities for people to learn or be trained in the new skills that are required by the change effort. Give them time to practice, to gain the skill, gain the confidence, get them to see that what seemed daunting at first maybe isn't upon further, upon further review, upon further practice, and the like. Sometimes people will be resistant not because they don't think they can do the new behaviors. They think they can, however, they don't want to. And then as a agent of change, you need to figure out why they might not want to. Even if they think they can, why would they not want to? And they can not want to for any of a number of reasons. But again, it's the medical model here. Diagnosis precedes intervention. In order to deal with a problem, you have to know the underlying root cause. So figure out why people are being resistant, and then take steps to address the resistance. So some quick wrap-up points, and it's something that we'll do in the program. As I said, we give out this change implementation survey, and we encourage people to use the survey as well as the organizing framework that I've walked you through, this DVP framework, as a checklist of action steps. But also in a more personalized way, what we encourage our people to do is to assess what it is that they individually do well versus less well, what is it that their group does well versus less well, and then action plan for improvement so that they can become more effective as agents of change. And the final point in my implied message is that during times of change, people, managers who are trying to make change happen often have a lot of control and influence power. Seems ironic because sometimes when you're trying to make change happen, you feel anything but powerful, influential, and in control. But if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. From your people's perspective, they're feeling a lot of uncertainty. They're feeling a lot of anxiety during times of change. And one thing we know is that when people are in an uncertain state, they need guidance, they're looking for direction, so you will get probably a bigger bang for your managerial buck in terms of what you do during times of change than you might get in a more steady state environment if such a thing even exists anymore. Okay, so thanks very much. I'll stop and be happy to take a few questions.
Thanks so much. That was great. And we have a number of really thoughtful questions. I just want to address one that's more directed toward me, and that's a number of folks are asking if they can get access to the slides for the presentation afterward, or will there be an archive available? And the answer is yes. We'll have next week, we will send that out to you by email. You'll get a link so you can review this presentation, and feel free at that point when you're reviewing it, if you have any additional questions, to email us. We'll be sure to get back to you. So some questions on the presentation. Here's one that came in. This person saying, our staff are responsible to raise their own salaries and therefore a little more like volunteers, though there's a clear organizational structure. Our core business is 45 years old and has completely changed in the last 3 years. We're having difficulty creating a change process that works for everyone. Some want input, others have a just tell me what to do attitude. Do you have any suggestions on how to shepherd this diverse group through the change process?
Well, I think talking helps. You know, first of all, getting the group together, to find out, what the concerns are. Where would they want to see the organization go, or maybe more to the point, how might they best get there? Usually, most organizations are not democracies, so senior executives are responsible for talking about the future state, getting people on board, and then once people have an understanding of where the organization's going and why, getting them to weigh in on perhaps the best ways to get there. That's where I think participation is particularly helpful. You don't want to necessarily ask everybody in the organization, where do you think we should go today? But once you've presumably gotten them on board through explanation, through communication and constant reminders of why we need to go there, presumably at that point they're more on board, and you can say to them, okay, look, the details of how we get there still need to be mapped out. And oftentimes people, as long-time or even short-term members of the organization, are quite expert about the work and perhaps the best way of transitioning from point A to point B. So I think senior managers can be very much direction setters, getting people on board, getting buy-in, and once that is achieved, or as that is achieved, getting people to figure out in a much more participatory fashion the details of how we get there.
That's great. There's a couple questions coming in where folks are, one person's saying, I found that involving people in the process of defining change is the best way to overcome resistance as they feel more invested in the change. A number of folks are saying, what should I do when senior management is not on board for any change initiatives? I'm in a middle management position, I'm trying to drive change up. Is it the same process that I need to use in terms of communicating up and down? What do I do when I'm in the middle?
Right. Well, it's a great question. And the answer, one answer is the process itself is largely the same. In other words, sometimes you need to be an agent of change upward, as you point out. But I would say that the same 4 steps all those levers need to be pressed. So if the resistance is coming from senior level management, you would still need to try to tell them, read them the riot act of how the current state is just not acceptable, provide compelling evidence of how that's true, show them a better alternative, right? Have a plan in place for how you're going to move from point A to point B, and then go to the senior executives who you think are dragging their feet or otherwise showing signs of resistance and try to understand where the resistance is coming from. And once you know what their underlying basis of the resistance is, you have a much better chance of addressing it. Or it doesn't ensure that you will, but if you don't understand where they're coming from and being resistant, you're really dead in the water. So you need to do that kind of digging work. But it's the same basic process, the same 4 categories of action steps for any type of change.
So some folks are sending in questions suggesting that maybe some of the change that they're being affected by is coming from sort of a state funding organization. So because of things that are well out of their control, they're being forced to change, and including outsourcing some people's positions or changing some roles. And folks are asking, how do we deal with this internal dissatisfaction with these changes that aren't really from the management within our organization, but coming from somewhere, a third party?
Well, welcome to the world. That's oftentimes, what I said at the outset, the impetus for change is usually what's going on in the external environment. We'd like to be ahead of the curve, be proactive. We'd like to anticipate where the environment is going and then take steps on a proactive basis. I would say even in that case, you're being responsive to your environment, although on an anticipatory basis. But other times, kind of the joke I made a moment ago about welcome to the world, that's kind of the way it works. Oftentimes is that change is foisted upon us. It's foisted upon us by the external environment in a variety of ways. So sometimes it's a little bit more shocking, when that happens. But the alternative is to be immobilized in the face of a dynamic environment, and then the organization goes nowhere. It's painful, but again, welcome to the world, the wacky world sometimes of organizational change.
That's great, Professor Brockner. I want to thank you for your time today. It's a really great presentation, some really thoughtful questions that came in, and thanks to all of you who are with us today. I just want to hand it off to Professor Horton for some final thoughts.
Well, I just wanted to say that Joel's presentation on managing change and this last question are particularly salient, because one of the things that we are seeing, just clear as a bell, is that the financial problems of federal, state, and local government are causing many state governments and federal governments to cut back on money for the nonprofit sector, particularly in the human services area. So this is a great example of an externally generated change where they are forcing major changes in the organization. I thought your response as to how to deal with it was just absolutely right. But this is going to be one of the recurring themes of the Developing Leaders program that's coming on, and that is that the fiscal future of very many nonprofits in the New York City area and beyond is going to be sharply constrained by cuts in public financing. And so developing leaders and more senior leaders are going to have to deal with this in a way that minimizes the impact on services. So your session on change management was particularly useful today. Thank you very much. It was a great job.
Thank you. Certainly my pleasure to be here. Thanks to both of you.
Great. Thanks so much, Professor Horton, Professor Brockner. Thanks to all of you for being here. Before we go, I'll just remind you once again that we will be sending out an archived version of the webinar. You'll get that by email, so you can review the slides and the presentation. I also invite you to check out our website, gsb.columbia.edu/execed. Learn more about the Developing Leaders Program for Nonprofit Professionals. That program is happening February 12th to 17th, 2012, and the application deadline is in just a couple weeks, December 1st, 2011. So check out the website and feel free to contact our Learning Solutions team, 212-854-3395. They'd be happy to speak with you further. Thanks so much for choosing to spend 30 minutes with us today as we explored this topic, and we appreciate your time and hope to see you soon at the Developing Leaders Program for Nonprofit Professionals. Thanks so much. Take care.